When Ford or GM rolls a new pickup truck off the line, there's a good chance it's headed for Canada, a market that consistently delivers massive profits for U.S. automakers. But that reliance could become their biggest vulnerability. If protectionist policies like tariffs push Canada too far, a coordinated consumer boycott could flip that advantage into a liability. The threat isn't theoretical. Canada has a proven track record of weaponizing consumer sentiment, and when it comes to high-margin vehicles that aren't viable elsewhere, the loss of Canadian buyers would cut deep into Detroit's bottom line.
The dollar is falling. The empire is fading. But your voice is rising. Don't just watch history happen. Be part of it. Why'd have you checkmark subscribe to this channel for more fearless analysis from Richard Wolff and voices the mainstream media refuses to platform?
What looks like a trade dispute could quickly escalate into a full-scale economic backlash. This isn't just about sales. It's about the entire ecosystem. The U.S. and Canadian auto industries are woven together through decades of cross-border production, where parts like pistons and wiring cross multiple times before a car is finished. If tariffs disrupt that flow, the damage wouldn't stop at the border. It would ripple across assembly lines, force plant closures, and destabilize supply chains that took generations to build. Canada's consumer leverage may be quiet, but it's potent, and if ignited, it could deliver a blow to U.S. automakers that no factory relocation could fix. The U.S. auto industry has always viewed itself as a global powerhouse. It produces millions of vehicles, dominates the domestic truck market, and proudly carries a legacy of Detroit muscle and innovation. But beneath the glossy branding and legacy slogans lies a deep, almost invisible dependency on Canada. What few Americans realize, and what more Canadians are beginning to understand, is this: Canada holds significant economic power over U.S. automakers, not through tariffs, not through manufacturing muscle, but through consumer demand. And in a world where trade tensions and protectionist rhetoric are back on the table, that demand is a sleeping giant. The threat? U.S. politicians are flirting with the idea of imposing tariffs up to 100% on Canadian auto imports. That's not a typo. 100%. The goal is to punish Canadian manufacturing and force operations back into U.S. borders. It's a classic move. Squeeze your partner to boost your own industry. But in this case, the strategy isn't just risky, it's reckless. Because the U.S. and Canadian auto industries aren't two separate operations. They're one. Decades of cooperation, starting with the 1965 Auto Pact, have built a manufacturing ecosystem that crosses the border constantly. Parts move back and forth multiple times before a single car rolls off the line. Pistons, transmissions, wire and harnesses, they don't just get made and shipped once. They're shared. They're integrated, and tariffs would throw a wrench into that delicate machine. This isn't an abstract concern. Disrupting the flow of parts would halt assembly lines, delay deliveries, and raise production costs on both sides. Auto plants in Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio would feel the hit. Entire supply chains would seize up, and the financial damage wouldn't be contained. It would ripple through every dealership, every part supplier, every transport company tied into the network. Now here's where Canada's leverage comes in. While the U.S. may believe it controls supply, Canada controls demand, and that matters more than people think. Canadian consumers buy nearly $90 billion in U.S.-made vehicles and parts every year. That's a huge number, larger than what Canada exports to the U.S. in automotive products. And it's not just volume, it's about profitability. Canadians buy the vehicles that U.S. automakers depend on most: high-margin pickup trucks and SUVs. These aren't niche vehicles. They're the profit engine for brands like Ford, GM, and Ram. Lose Canadian buyers, and you're not just losing units. You're gutting the bottom line. And that's why a consumer boycott in Canada isn't just symbolic. It's a weapon. This has happened before. Canadians have shown they can mobilize against economic aggression. When political tensions flared in the past, grassroots boycotts targeted U.S. tourism and U.S. wine, with real, measurable consequences. The auto sector is even more vulnerable. A coordinated refusal to buy U.S.-made vehicles would hit where it hurts: the profit margins of America's biggest automakers. It's not theoretical. The consumer pressure would be immediate. Ford, GM, and Stellantis would face an impossible situation: caught between nationalist pressure in Washington and financial collapse in Canada. Because these companies aren't just American giants, they're binational employers. Thousands of Canadian workers build their vehicles. Their plants in Ontario and Quebec aren't side projects. They're vital to North American production. Now imagine the internal strife. On one side, the U.S. operations will be pushing for tariffs, lobbying Washington to protect American jobs. On the other, their Canadian divisions will be fighting to survive, pushing back against a boycott that's killing sales and threatening plants. Corporate paralysis would follow. Decision-makers would be split. Lobbying would become incoherent, and the auto giants would lose their unified voice. It's not just about dollars. It's about stability. When North America looks unstable, investors get nervous. Global capital doesn't like unpredictability. And with the electric vehicle transition already underway, the last thing U.S. and Canadian manufacturers need is for their region to appear dysfunctional, because that's when capital flows east to Europe, to Asia, to anywhere that looks less like a geopolitical headache. If the U.S. imposes tariffs, it's not just risking a Canadian boycott. It's risking a fracture in global confidence. And the fallout wouldn't end there. Tariffs would increase prices for American consumers. That's not speculation. That's basic economics. A 100% tariff means doubling the cost of Canadian-built vehicles. Automakers can't eat that cost, so prices go up. For consumers already battling high interest rates and inflation, that's a final straw. Sales would fall. And don't think the U.S. can just build its way out of the problem. Shifting production south of the border isn't like flipping a switch. It takes years to build new plants. It takes billions to set up new supplier networks. It requires trained workers, stable infrastructure, and massive logistical changes. All of this while trying to maintain competitive pricing and meet delivery deadlines in a tightening global market. Meanwhile, Canada would take a massive hit too. Let's not kid ourselves. If tariffs were imposed and plants started closing, the Canadian manufacturing sector would suffer. Thousands of jobs gone. Communities devastated. For a country that's already seen a long decline in manufacturing employment, this would be catastrophic. So why would Canada even respond? Because doing nothing would mean accepting the death of its auto industry. Fighting back with consumer power, with coordinated boycotts, might be the only move left on the table. And it's one that could work. Because at the end of the day, U.S. automakers don't just care about nationalism. They care about profits. If a boycott tanks their Canadian revenue, they'll feel it immediately. Earnings reports will show red. Shareholders will panic. Executives will be forced to act. They'll have to choose, support tariffs in Washington or preserve sales in Canada. They won't be able to do both. The U.S. might think it has the upper hand. It might think that threatening Canadian exports gives it leverage. But that's a miscalculation. Because Canada's power doesn't come from what it sells. It comes from what it buys. And if that buying stops, the entire U.S. auto industry could be thrown into chaos. Ford, GM, Stellantis, they've all tied their business models to an integrated North American market. They rely on Canadian workers and Canadian customers. Disrupting that relationship risks collapsing the very system that makes them profitable. And for what? A few political points? Protectionist rhetoric might play well in certain circles. But it's a losing game, because tariffs won't just hurt Canada. They'll hurt every factory that relies on cross-border trade, every consumer forced to pay higher prices, every investor watching the continent descend into internal trade wars. There are no winners here. Only mutual destruction. If cooler heads don't prevail, if the U.S. insists on escalating tensions, then Canadians have every right, every reason to fight back, not with violence, not with protests, but with their wallets. No more U.S.-made trucks. No more SUVs from Michigan. No more pretending the border doesn't cut both ways. This isn't about nationalism. It's about economic survival. And if Washington won't listen to logic, maybe they'll listen to market signals. Maybe they'll hear the silence from Canadian dealerships. Maybe they'll notice when earnings start to slip, when shareholder confidence dips, when the math no longer works. Because if Canadians flex their consumer power, The message will be loud and clear. You can't bully your largest customer. If this breakdown helped you understand just how fragile the U.S.-Canada auto relationship really is, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who still thinks tariffs are harmless. Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more content that tells it exactly like it is. Let's keep going, because the stakes here are far greater than just a few factories and price hikes. We're talking about the potential unraveling of a decades-old industrial alliance that has underpinned the economic strength of not just Canada and the United States, but all of North America. For over half a century, the U.S. and Canada have operated under a simple but powerful economic principle: mutual reliance. Canada manufactures, the U.S. consumes, and in return the U.S. supplies. Canada consumes. It's a loop, a balance, a functioning, deeply integrated system that has kept millions employed and entire regional economies afloat. You break that loop, you don't just shift production, you create chaos. The North American auto supply chain wasn't designed to be picked apart. It wasn't built for conflict. It was built for efficiency. Pistons made in Windsor, transmissions assembled in Ohio, wiring looms routed through Ontario. These aren't interchangeable parts in a global shopping cart. They are the result of years of painstaking logistical coordination. Disrupting this system with tariffs? That's not smart trade policy. That's lighting a match in a fireworks factory. And the U.S. knows this. The automakers know this. But politicians don't care. They see tariffs as political currency, an easy way to look tough, to please domestic constituencies, to act pro-American. But they're ignoring a simple truth. You don't win trade wars with your closest ally. Canada is not China. This isn't about dumping cheap goods or stealing intellectual property. This is about a trusted partner, one that has built its economy in tandem with the U.S. model, being treated like a threat. It's not just insulting, it's destabilizing. And if Canada is going to be treated like an adversary, it has every right to respond like one, not with threats, not with blockades, but with targeted consumer power. Boycotting U.S.-made vehicles may sound dramatic. It may sound emotional, but it's rational. Because when you're left with no industrial policy of your own, when your factories are hanging by a thread, when your government refuses to intervene, consumer action is what's left. And it would hit the U.S. where it hurts most. Start with the facts. Canada is the #1 foreign market for U.S. vehicles. That includes those high-margin, high-profit trucks and SUVs that Americans don't even try to sell globally. These vehicles, F-150s, Silverados, Rams, don't have global audiences. They don't sell in Tokyo or Berlin or Sao Paulo. They sell in Ontario, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan. You lose at demand, you don't replace it. And don't underestimate the profit margins here. These aren't compact cars with razor-thin margins. These are the vehicles that carry entire product lines. They fund R&D. They subsidize less profitable models. They're the golden goose of Detroit. Lose a chunk of that market, you lose real money. And it's not just a loss of revenue. It's the signal it sends. If Canadian consumers stop buying U.S. vehicles, Wall Street will notice. Stock prices will slip. CEOs will get nervous. Boardrooms will scramble. Because every lost sale in Canada isn't just a missed opportunity. It's a direct hit to quarterly earnings. And here's where it gets worse for the automakers. They'll be fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, Washington politicians are telling them to embrace tariffs, to stop outsourcing, to bring jobs home. On the other side, their Canadian branches are sounding alarms. Sales are collapsing. Customers are walking away. Dealers are furious. What do? Abandon the Canadian market? Fire thousands of Canadian employees? Or do they push back against their own government? Risk political fallout to protect their bottom line? There's no clean choice. That's the trap. And it's not just a trap for automakers. It's a trap for the entire North American industrial strategy. Because once investors see that this region can't manage its internal relationships, once it becomes clear that even U.S. and Canadian trade can be upended by one presidential tweet or populist tantrum, they'll start moving money elsewhere. They'll take their electric vehicle investments and send them to Germany, or Japan, or South Korea. They'll move battery plants out of Ontario and into stable jurisdictions. They'll stop seeing North America as a unified bloc and start seeing it as a fractured risk zone. And the long-term consequences? They're devastating. Forget about competing with China. Forget about being a leader in autonomous driving or green transportation. If the U.S. and Canada can't even maintain a basic industrial partnership, they'll get left behind. This is in the 1990s. Global capital doesn't wait. Innovation doesn't pause for politics. So where does that leave Canadians? With hard choices and harsh realities. The Canadian government may hesitate. It may delay. It may plead for diplomacy. But the public? The public has power. Every car not purchased. Every dealership ignored. Every financing plan rejected. That's a political message. A market signal. A strike without a picket line. And unlike political statements, this one hurts the pocketbook. Canadians don't have to boycott all American goods. They don't have to rage in the streets. They just need to recognize their economic weight, their position as buyers, their importance to a system that has taken them for granted. Because if that message lands, if it resonates through boardrooms and profit sheets, it will force change. The irony is brutal. A policy meant to protect American industry could wind up wrecking it. A tariff aimed at punishing Canadian factories could trigger a backlash that crushes U.S. automakers' most profitable market. A move to control the supply chain could implode the demand side instead. This is what happens when political theater replaces economic strategy. And the fallout won't be short-term. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding sales, rebuilding integration. It takes years, maybe decades. And that's assuming the damage isn't permanent. Because once Canadian buyers moved other brands, to other vehicles, to different supply chains, why would they come back? If the U.S. wants to start a trade fight, it better be ready for the consequences. Because the target thinks it's hitting Canadian exports isn't the real vulnerability. It's the U.S. auto industry's own dependency on Canadian demand. A boycott won't just bruise the industry. It'll expose the myth of self-reliance. You can't bully a market that keeps your business afloat. You can't antagonize a partner and expect loyalty in return. And you can't dismantle a shared economy without paying the price. The U.S. auto industry isn't untouchable. It's vulnerable. It's exposed. And if it pushes Canada too far, it may learn the hard way what economic retaliation looks like. Not from governments, but from consumers who are tired of being treated like a disposable line on someone else's balance sheet. This isn't some abstract trade dispute happening in boardrooms or behind closed doors in Washington or Ottawa. It's about the livelihoods of tens of thousands of Canadian workers. It's about families in Oshawa, in Windsor, in Ingersoll, who spent generations building vehicles that Americans drive every single day. And now they're being told, implicitly or explicitly, that their work doesn't matter, that their jobs are expendable, that their contributions to one of the most integrated industrial systems in the world are nothing more than a bargaining chip in a political poker game. That kind of treatment doesn't go unnoticed, and it doesn't go unanswered. What happens when people who've been loyal to a system realize that system no longer serves them? They stop playing by its rules. That's exactly what Canadian consumers can do right now. Not out of spite, not out of nationalism, but out of sheer necessity. If the U.S. insists on punishing Canadian production with tariffs, making Canadian-made cars uncompetitive in the U.S., then Canadians have every right to stop buying U.S.-made cars. It's not anti-American. It's economic self-defense. Because if Washington wants to force automakers to relocate to the U.S., to shut down Canadian factories and pull the rug out from under Canadian workers, then Canadian consumers should respond with the only leverage they have, their wallets. That's not emotion. That's power. That's leverage. And it's been used before, successfully. Go back to the softwood lumber disputes, the wine boycotts, the cross-border tourism bans after political insults and trade threats. Canadians have shown that when pushed hard enough, they push back with focus, with discipline, and with real economic impact. Apply that same strategy to the auto sector, and things get serious. Fast. We're talking about tens of billions in annual sales from the U.S. to Canada. And we're talking about flagship products, the big sellers that U.S. automakers rely on to carry their entire portfolios. A drop in Canadian demand wouldn't be a footnote. It would be a boardroom crisis. And here's the irony. The U.S. would have done this to itself. Because the Canadian auto industry doesn't need to be cut out. It needs to be strengthened. It needs the ability to compete, to grow, to evolve with a global shift toward EVs and advanced manufacturing. Tariffs don't create that environment. They kill it. And in doing so, they undercut the very goals they claim to support. You want secure supply chains? Then don't destroy your partner's industrial base. You want economic stability in North America? Then don't throw trade grenades across the border. You want to compete with China, Germany, Korea? Then don't decapitate the most efficient and integrated auto network on the continent. The facts are clear. The supply chain is real. The economic integration is deep. And Canada isn't just a sidekick in this story. It's a pillar, a critical piece of the engine that powers American automotive dominance. Tariffs would crack that pillar. And a consumer boycott would push the collapse into full motion. That's the mutual destruction scenario, the worst-case outcome, and it's entirely avoidable. The path forward is just as clear. Respect the integration. Reinforce the partnership. Invest in Canadian manufacturing, not because it's charity, but because it's strategic, because it makes sense, because it's cheaper, faster, and more stable than trying to rebuild a broken system from scratch. But if the U.S. chooses confrontation over cooperation, Canadians will have no choice but to respond. A boycott wouldn't be easy. It would require coordination, discipline. It would mean walking past showrooms filled with shiny, powerful trucks and saying no, not because they aren't good vehicles, but because the people who build them are trying to crush your industry. Because you're not going to spend your hard-earned dollars funding the destruction of your own economy. That's not political. That's logical. And if that boycott catches on, if enough Canadians start to realize they don't have to play by Washington's rules, then everything changes. Ford, GM, Stellantis, they'll start listening, not because of headlines or hashtags, but because of earnings reports, because of falling revenue, because of pressure from shareholders who want answers about why Canadian sales are evaporating. That's real leverage. That's the power of demand. And Canada has it. So the next time a U.S. lawmaker throws out another protectionist soundbite, remember, this isn't a one-way street. Canada has options. Canadians have choices. And if those choices are exercised, they can shake the very foundation of a U.S. auto industry. Because in the end, no matter how powerful an automaker is, no matter how many factories it builds or trucks it assembles, if people stop buying, it all comes to a halt. If this opened your eyes to how much economic power Canada actually holds, hit the like button. Share it with someone who thinks Canada is powerless in this fight. Comment below if you're done playing defense. And subscribe. We're just getting started.